Hello everyone, in this video we'll be covering how to solve quadratic equations. Now this video will cover manipulation of equations and the strategy going into an equation when it looks very complicated and you don't really know how to approach it. So prerequisites to this video is how to already solve equations that are linear, so those are easier than quadratic equations. So if you're unfamiliar about how to work with equations that are linear, please look at my solving linear equations video. To solve quadratic equations, we also need to know how to factorize. So we need to know how to take out a common factor, and we need to know how to factorize quadratics. So I also have videos for those two. This video will be about manipulation of equations and what we should be trying to achieve to solve the equation. So let's look at an example of a quadratic equation. Let's look at the equation x times x plus 6 is equal to 3x squared minus 8. So we want to solve for x. Now this is going to be different to a linear equation. In a linear equation, we wanted to get all the x's on one side, all the a's or whatever letter we're working with on one side, and everything else on the other side. With these types of problems, we want to take everything to one side and leave the other side as a 0. So we're not separating the x's from the constants. We're going to take everything to one side, and from there we're going to factorize that side. So firstly I need to expand out this because I want everything standing individually. I don't want brackets and I don't want denominators or anything like that because I want to factorize it. So let's multiply this out on this side. Multiplying this out gives me x squared plus 6x if I multiply this x in like that. So now we should do what I said earlier. We need to take everything to one side of the equation. So let's take everything to this side of the equation. So that gives me x squared minus 6x as before stayed on the side of the equation, and the positive 3x squared becomes a minus 3x squared when we take it over the equal sign, and the minus 8 becomes a positive 8 when we took it over the equal sign, and we are left with 0 on the other side. Now we need to add like terms. So we have a 1x squared here and we have a minus 3x squared here. So it's 1 minus 3 and we end up with minus 2x squareds. So we have minus 2x squared plus 6x plus 8 is equal to 0. Now I can take out a common factor here. Now when we're working with an equation, we're taking out a constant common factor, so we can actually divide everything by that common factor and we don't need to take it out. So I can divide everything by the minus 2. Because when we're working with an equation, we can divide both sides by the same number and be okay. So I'm going to divide this whole side by minus 2. So if I divide this by minus 2, I end up with x squared. And if I divide this by minus 2, I end up with minus 3x. And divide this by minus 2, I end up with minus 4 is equal to 0. And now we have to factorize it. So factorizing this gives me x minus 4, x plus 1 is equal to 0. If you're unfamiliar on how to get from this step to this step, then you should watch the Factorizing Quadratics video, which I have already uploaded. So from here now we have two things multiplied together that gives me 0. So to get 0 when I multiply two things together, one of them has to be 0. So if this was 0, this whole thing would become 0 and it would be true. Or if this was 0, this whole thing would be 0 and it would be true. So either x minus 4 is 0 or x plus 1 is 0. And this is how we're getting our solutions. So if x minus 4 is 0, that means x is 4 to give me x minus 4 is 0. Or if this bracket is 0, we'd have minus 1 is x to get this whole bracket is 0 and therefore the whole thing is 0. So x is 4 or x is minus 1. And those are my solutions. So we have x is equal to 4 or x is equal to minus 1. So let's recall the method that we went through. So we multiplied out our brackets and then we took everything to one side of the equation and we left the other side as 0. And there we could factorize so that we could get this solution here. Now let's look at a scenario where we have brackets in the denominator. Let's look at the equation. X over x minus 1 plus 3 over x minus 2 is equal to 3. Now the first thing you should do when you see x's in the denominators is you should say your restrictions. Now, we are not allowed to divide by 0. So we cannot have this bracket being equal to 0 because then we will be dividing by 0 in this fraction. And same here, we will also be dividing by 0 if x minus 2 is 0. So what value of x makes x minus 1 0? 1 makes x minus 1 0. So x cannot be equal to 1, otherwise we will be dividing by 0. And similarly here, x cannot be equal to 2, otherwise we would be dividing by 0. So we need to keep those in mind going forward. Another interesting thing to note is that we shouldn't be timesing by 0 either. And why we shouldn't do that is because the whole thing will just devolve to 0. If I times this side by 0, the whole thing becomes 0, and this side becomes 0, and we lose all the information we needed. And that's not helpful for solving equations. So we can just keep that in the back of our minds. Now, the first thing I want to do when I'm dealing with something like this is I want to get rid of those denominators. So how I'm going to do that is I'm going to multiply by the denominators. So I have an x minus 1 here, so I'm going to multiply everything by x minus 1 so that it cancels off here and it'll end up on the top here and here. And the same goes for minus 2. I'm going to multiply everything by the minus 2 so it will go away from the bottom. So that will give me x times x minus 2 plus 3 times x minus 1 is equal to 3x minus 2 x minus 1. So what happened is, if I multiply the whole thing by minus 1, the minus 1 does not end up in this term because it has the bottom. It will end up in this term and it will end up here. So if I multiply everything by minus 2, it will end up here, it won't end up here because of the cancelling, and it will end up here. And now we multiply everything out, which is going to give us lots and lots of stuff, and then we need to take it to one side. So multiplying everything out gives me x squared minus 2x plus 3x minus 3 is equal to 3x squared minus 9x minus 6. So that's just expanding all these brackets out. Now we take everything to one side. So we get x squared minus 2x plus 3x minus 3 minus 3x squared, because I took the 3x squared over and it changed signs, plus x, the 9 goes across, and minus 6 is equal to 0. Now I add like terms, so I look for all the x squareds. I have 1x squared and I have a minus 3x squared, so I end up with a minus 2x squared. Let's look at the x's. I have a minus 2x plus 3x plus 9x. So I have 10x. Positive 10x. So let's look at our constants. We have a minus 3 and a minus 6. We have minus 9 is equal to 0. And now we factorize this. Now it does not look like it factorizes. So what we would have to do is use the quadratic formula. And that will give us my two values of x and those of my solutions. If you all recall, the quadratic formula is minus b plus or minus root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And I will get two solutions by first making this a plus at the plus or minus section, and I'll get the second solution by making it a minus. And that'll give me my two solutions for x. And I just need to make sure that it's not 1 and it's not 2, because from earlier I had the restrictions, it can't be 1 and it can't be 2, because I don't want to divide by 0. And that is how you solve quadratic type equations. You need to know how to manipulate the equation, and once you've manipulated it to have everything on the one side, you need to factorize it. So if you're struggling with your factorization, you need to brush up on that so that you can deal with equations. I hope you now all know how to approach a question when you're given an equation with one variable, and how to manipulate the equation so that you can solve it. And most importantly, remember that you can't divide by 0, so remember your restrictions. If there are any other topics you would like me to cover in a video, please leave your suggestion in the comment section below. Happy studying, guys.